Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 37, Stock Designs, Choose, Use, Change, and Make. Good afternoon, everybody. It is 2:30 p.m. here in the Mountain Time Zone in Albuquerque, New Mexico, here in the shadow of the foothills of the Sandia Mountains. And I am Eric Campbell here to talk to you again about machine embroidery and all things stock designs today. Today is a little special because, number one, I am running on very little sleep today. If you don't know, I just launched a big product with my friends at Embroidery. We've been working on some stuff for a while, and we're up into the wee hours, and I just about greeted the morning. So I'm just going to say this, guys. If I'm a little punchy this day, expect that. But the good thing is I'm really happy about the topic we're going to talk about. Stock designs. It's something that I've seen from just about every angle you can. I've worked on stock designs, worked with stock designs, of course, as a commercial embroiderer. And I'll the first to tell you that I didn't use a whole lot of them, but I had them for very specific reasons. And I've helped with people's stock design problems before and helped them work through their usage of stock designs. And I have made lots of stock designs, both stock designs for my own small collection of stock, and I've worked on other people's collections of stock. Not everything that I can show you guys, because some stuff, as you know, if it's made for someone else, I can't always explain or show it. But I can tell you that I have worked on creating stock designs and stock assets for people as well, including stock fonts, which I think is kind of part of this whole discussion about stock. But today we're going to go ahead and talk all about stock designs, why we use them, when we use them, what we have to watch out for. And like I said, this may be, as many things are, part 1 of 2. We may not get that far. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about digitizing them as well, and maybe how you do some stuff, maybe some pitfalls to avoid, stuff like that. But I will go as far as I can, and hopefully not too far into bonus time, because I have other events going on this afternoon, this evening. So first, before anything else starts, let's go ahead and see who else is in the chats, because I can see you guys are blowing up the comment section already. Glad to see you here. Let's start with Cindy King out in Texas. Good afternoon. I hope you got a nap. Yeah, I did not get a nap. I was still working on the project. When you roll out a big project, like let's say a big website, there's often things that you have to work on that come up as you launch. And no matter how much you prepare for launch, no matter what you do to prepare, there's always more you can do. There's always more that you can cover. Glad to see Jamie ZSK. Yes, I have seen some of your awesome videos. Thank you for coming in, and thanks for coming. I mean, I'm glad to be doing this. Talking about stock designs, honestly, there's a couple of different angles I'm going to come at it, and I've turned around in my career on how to use them and when to use them and what they're good for. So honestly, glad to talk about it, and glad to see what's going on in the comments, because it's because of my interaction with you guys who did different kinds of decoration maybe than I did. I was very primarily business to business, corporate, government, military, police. That was mostly what I did. So knowing that, I mean, knowing that most of what I did was commercial in its nature, despite the fact that I have done some fashion stuff, but it was all bespoke fashion stuff, retail fashion stuff. So none of these things really lend themselves to stock designs, but learning from people who do use them has really helped me to understand a little bit more about stock. Darren. Good evening, Darren, coming in from YouTube. Glad to see you were able to comment on YouTube. We've had issues with that before, but I've seen more and more people coming to YouTube. So if you haven't gotten out there before, get out to the YouTube channel. The great thing about it is we're going to talk about some articles and stuff, and because the way YouTube structure is way easier for me to throw links in there, there are already links in the description there. I will pop them into the description on Facebook later, but if you go to your description now, you will have links to all the stuff that I'm going to talk about as far as articles and stuff that I've got online. Just is in here from Sweden. Glad to see you here. It must be a crazy hour for you. Jeff says, help, looking forward to it. Yeah, stock designs are a little weird. We'll have some discussion about it, but there are some things that are, it's supposed to be hello. Well, help also works for stock designs, because quite frankly, they often cause problems. Virginia is saying hello. Justin's in hello from sunny Arizona. Digitizer himself, Justin. I don't know how much stock design stuff you've worked on, but I know as digitizers, we like to make a lot of the stuff that we do, so we often don't use them because we can make whatever we want. Frank Dunn from the UK, thank you for sharing the post always, Frank, and glad to see you in here in the evening for you. And we also have Ramona coming in. Want to hear more? Yeah, we'll talk about more later. We've got some more stuff coming on. Like I said, there's more projects going on from Brilliance. We'll talk about that. If you haven't seen that we recently updated the program, the platform is out. 1.165, check that out, because there's some really fun stuff in there, and we'll talk about that later. That's not what we're doing here today, but there is a little talk about what we're doing with that as well. And Christine says, good afternoon, Eric. Punchy is fine. Sometimes the best stuff comes out of your mouth when you're tired. You would know. You've seen me at trade shows getting real punchy. So hopefully you are correct. I know my wife said that I was certainly on it today. I was having some issues. Jewel Brown Shelby. Hello, everyone. Happy to see you here, Jewel. I saw you tune into the two regular guys this morning. You guys didn't hear that one. The Reggie's Awards announcements were starting this morning, so that was really cool. If you don't know about the Reggie's Awards, go check out tworegularguys.com. That's the number 2regularguys.com for the podcast that I produce. And it's kind of like the old grandfather of podcasts for the industry. We've done 8 years of it. And the great thing is we're going to do awards soon, so you can recommend people and products you like for awards there. Jeff says, I need help with the patch borders. No, you don't. Your patch borders look great, sir. And by the way, if you haven't seen, Jeff's made some really cool motif-based patch borders that look like mirroring. It's something that I've done before and that I've showed a little bit on the last show. So it's really cool stuff. So anyway, with all that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and start getting into the topic. I could go ahead and go on and on and on with the comments. I love talking to everybody, but let's go ahead and get into stock designs. So let's discuss, when do we use stock? Why do we use stock? What kind of concepts are involved? And what do we mean when we talk about stock? I mean, first of all, when I'm just going to define stock designs, I consider stock designs any pre-made design that is not particular to one client, not particular to one, because here's the thing. Yes, there are such things as corporate stock designs. There are people who sell corporate logo stock designs. I think that is a hard place to tread because there's all sorts of copyright waters that we wade into that we might not want to get into. However, when I'm talking about stock designs in the context of what we're talking about today, we're talking about designs that are, if not generic, if not necessarily generic, they might have specific themes, specific styles, and they might be useful for particular segments of clients. They are not meant for one client. They are not bespoke. They're not one-off. They're not made for one logo, one event, one anything. That's when I'm talking about stock design. So stuff that you can reuse, usually themed, and often sold that way, sold in a generic stance, made to be used for multiple people for multiple reasons and personalized on the fly. So that's really what we're talking about, right? So in any case, that's something that I want to discuss today. We're talking about stock designs, but we're going to talk about how to use them, when to use them, stuff like that. And what I'm going to go ahead and do right now first, I'm going to bring in my screen, and we've got a couple of articles, and I'm going to go ahead and put these in the comments. So anybody who is on, especially on Facebook, go ahead and grab these from the comments if you want to check this out. This first article is one I did in Printware some time ago. The much beloved and sadly gone, or at least changed into Graphics Pro Printware. And this one was about selecting stock designs, but it's also about when and where we should use stock designs. Now, by the way, like I said before, this is me talking about a business-to-business standpoint. Business-to-business standpoint is where I came from at first. But what I'm going to say is, if you are going business to customer direct, if you're doing personalization, if you are a gift embroiderer, and we'll talk about that again, it'll come up over and over because these are the people who I finally found out they really make the best use out of stock designs. If you're a gift embroiderer, some of this doesn't make the same sense. If you're someone like me who's usually business to business, these are the kind of things that I thought about when we're talking about selecting and working with stock designs, right? So when is the right time? And I've got a couple of things here that make sense to me, right? Number one, when schedules are too tight for design work. Now, I'll say this. These days, we now have digitizers who are decent digitizers with 24-hour turnarounds. So quite frankly, most of the time, we can get custom work done very quickly. But I'm talking about the kind of schedule where somebody is going to walk into your shop and they are not going to leave without an item, or they're going to come back that afternoon, must have the item right then and there. Fairly frequently, that's something that's not going to be useful to use any sort of custom digitizing for, especially if there's no design concepts. And that's kind of where we transition into the second half of this. When a client has a concept but lacks specific vision. And I'd say this is probably one of the top times I'd use stock. For me, stock often comes in when a client says, I have this thing I want, but I don't have any particular vision, or I don't have art, or, and this gets into kind of my third point on this, they don't have budget for creating or recreating or working on their art. And frankly, this can happen in the business-to-business space as much as it can happen in the gift space, as much as it can happen in any sort of personalization work. By the way, monogrammers, another set of people who use tons of stock designs. So it's really awesome to see them and how they use them as well. Because like I said, I think stock fonts and stock decorations that go with fonts and typefaces also kind of go into this conversation about stock designs. But fairly frequently, a client will have a concept but lack a specific vision. And I will say that this is not, this is not happening all the time, but in the business-to-business space, it absolutely can happen. We're talking about especially small to medium, when you're working with people who have small out-of-their-house businesses. If there's somebody who, like, for me, it was a lot of plumbing. You have a single sole proprietor who has a plumbing shop, and it's literally his truck. These folks fairly often don't have it. And by the way, I'm going to call out a comment. I absolutely have to do that. First, I'll say, hi, Dan. Happy to see you there. But Ramona says, I want a deer head on a hat. This right here, this comment, this is the reason 100% I use stock in my business-to-business kind of life. Because I very frequently was making these elks. And it was like I was making elk heads constantly. And if you've ever heard me talk about stock designs, you've heard me complain. I'd say, I've used stock probably, as many times as I have toes and fingers in my business-to-business life. But when I did, the top reason was I will not digitize another bugling elk head when no one could tell the difference between them, no matter if it was a picture of one that they took themselves or not. I had issues where I was making all of these renditions where I'm working on these elk heads, where I'm working on these antelopes, where I'm working on fish, but it's a lot of work. They're very difficult. And unless they're art pieces that are going to be reproduced over and over again, or they're really awesome pieces. There's a guy who actually got to see out in Fort Worth at the last Fort Worth show before everything kind of went the way it went. And he actually won some awards from the Impressions Awards. Daniel Cummins does incredible work with fish, does incredible work with wildlife. However, for me, I realized that most of the time when someone brought me a picture of an elk head, they just wanted to show me the kind of look they wanted it. They wanted it bugling. They wanted it standing like this. And I could bring in a stock design and I wouldn't have to digitize the thing from a photo. So even if they could pay for it, the truth of the matter is, even when they paid for it, because I used to work on flat rate for digitizing at the company that I was at, it meant that they were usually getting twice as much time as anyone else for me to do these nice renditions and really weren't paying for it, even when they were paying the full tilt for the digitizing. Number one, they felt a little salty because they're paying full tilt for the digitizing. Number two, I was working twice the hours that it would have taken to do more logo work. And if we could have taken on more lucrative logo work in the meantime, because these orders were often low count orders, it would have made a ton of sense. So when you're talking about groups like that, that's when we can use stock. And here's the thing. So here, first of all, we start with this, right? When the time is lacking, when we don't have time to go through custom design, digitizing approvals and everything else, use stock. That makes sense when you can. When you can. Obviously, if it's a logo, it's a logo. You can't do that. But if somebody is bringing you something and they say, I just absolutely have to have this embroidered, but there's a chance that we could use personalization plus stock, if you could do personalization plus stock, text plus stock, it's a classic way to use stock. Sometimes you'll be able to get things done, especially when we're talking about things like events, especially when we were doing like live sporting events, family reunions, stuff like that. Frequently, even if they brought you art, if they didn't have the money to handle the art, or if they didn't have the time to wait, they were on an emergency, somebody didn't get things done, you could throw together a themed design and custom text, and that personalized version of the stock was usually good. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and bring in some slides about stock designs that I had from a recent workshop that sadly I didn't get to teach too much this year. It was something that I taught earlier on the year and then didn't get to do the other sessions that were available, but I'm going to give you a little bit of that here. So let's go ahead and talk about that. And by the way, I'm going to bring up another comment. I love this right here. Virginia says, if I have 1,000 designs, they say, do you have something else? Yeah, you know what? Those kind of shoppers, those folks are hard. That's the kind of person I'd want to turn loose on an online design site. The problem is then you get poor quality and very frequently, they can't pay attention to the things we have to pay attention to for how we select stock designs like sizing. We'll talk about that again later. But yeah, that can happen. And when you're talking about gift shop, especially gift shop embroidery, that one's a little hard for that. And that's where I love using online design collections, especially if you can curate your own online design collection. It doesn't mean you're making all of them. It means you're curating the design collection, allowing them to see the pieces that work well for you, that have the right sizes, or you can categorize them according to what they can fit on. That's some great stuff. I actually got to work with, and I won't say company names or anything, I got to work with people who were doing stuffed animals, and I worked on a bunch of little icons for the bellies of little tiny stuffed animals. And it was great because we actually did produce the stock designs. The thing is, they were all produced to work on the plush material and to work with the sizing required. And because we had a collection that was curated, it meant that there were no stinkers. There was no trying to resize things that won't work. There was no redigitizing things randomly. There was no issue with the actual intended usage. So I think even if you aren't making your own collection, it's a good idea to consider curating a collection if you're somebody who has a particular product that you're doing all the time. If your jam is the back of mittens, find something that works on polar flace and that works on the size that you can get in your mitten hoop, and have a collection of those ahead of time ready to go to hand to a client so that they're not looking through a giant website full of stock designs and picking things that are made for jacket backs and asking you why you can't shrink it down. Curating is always good, whether it's garment selections or stock design selections. Anyway, let's jump into these slides for just a minute, and we'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about stock designs and what they can work for. And I'll say truthfully, like I said, in business to business work, they were less useful for me than they were for other folks that I knew. And like I said, once I got into things like, and by the way, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Cindy King has a great comment that I'm going to bring in real fast. Most stock designs I've seen are not workable on caps. Absolutely not. And there is a dearth of designs made just for caps because it is a little harder to sell these things. It's also why I'm going to talk about this later. Native stock designs. Stock designs are native to software that allow for some more work that you couldn't do with a standard stitch-based stock design are pretty rare as well, because whether it's putting them only on caps or sequencing for them for caps and having them be a little less efficient, or working in a native format, it reduces the amount of places you can sell it. And that's the thing you have to remember. You have to think like a stock design seller. They want to digitize once and sell everywhere in every format. And that means that pretty frequently, they're not going to take a lot of quality things into account that we might take into account, digitizing for specific materials, specific garments, and contexts. So we have to think about that when we're using stock designs or when we're creating stock designs. We'll talk about it again later. Let's go ahead and start with this, though. Stock designs, once again, less useful for some markets than others. For business to business, I almost never use them. When did I use them? When a business had a company party or a kickball team or something where they were going to go to an event somewhere and they wanted something tropical, maybe. They wanted some outdoor stuff. Like, again, we've got that deer on hat syndrome. That's pretty frequently what happened to me, but really none of this stuff was for business to business. Almost always a business is going to come in with art. They're going to come in with logos. So the reason I say this is not to dissuade you from using stock designs. It's to know when they're useful. And anyone who's brand new to commercial embroidery right now and someone is trying to sell you a pack of 20,000 stock designs that they haven't gone through, think really hard as to whether or not you need them. Maybe buy access or buy them one at a time and make sure you factor that into what you charge your client. Unless you have a gift shop market or a market with personalization where it is very common for someone to come in who just wants a themed design, a name on a particular item, and it's more about the gift, about the item than it is about the design and the promotion, then a collection of stock designs might be worthwhile for you. Even then, I would very much consider buying them piecemeal or showing people catalogs of designs and helping them by curating those designs. So it really depends on where you're coming at this. But for me, most of my time, stock designs were not the chief work that I was doing. It was fairly often custom design work, and it wasn't a lot of stock design work. So here are the places where it made the most sense for me, for the people who I used, who I talked to, and the people who are using them in my businesses. Outdoors, absolutely. People who are doing outdoor stuff, when we had fishermen, we had hunters, stock designs were just absolutely on the menu. They were consistently used. Though, as we can see, we're going to talk about sizing later. The piece that I used on the right here, it's actually for a prop. And that one was because time was tight, not because it was outdoors. And you'll see that it's resized, and that resizing, despite the fact that I had stitch processing, didn't go so great. It looks pretty good, but if you look at that belly of the fish, that shading is rough. That is too big and too thick and too open. But that's the thing about stock designs. Stock designs have a limited range of resizing and editability. Anyway, outdoor, great place to use them. I think if you do a lot of outdoors work, then absolutely having stock designs at the ready and knowing who you want to get those from. By the way, one of the big things about selecting stock designs, having favorite stock design digitizers that you know are quality and who can work with some efficiency, because a lot of stock designs are made for the home market. Nothing wrong with the home market, but somebody with a single needle machine who's used to changing thread fairly often and is making one piece that is a masterwork for themselves or for a gift for one person they know and love, is willing to put up with a lot less efficiency than someone who's making thousands of the things or who will be using this design over and over and over again. So make sure you think about that when you're talking about where you select them from. Other places, like I said, gift shop and bridal, believe it or not. Bridal, there's a fair number of those too, where it's a themed set of designs, but people aren't bringing in their own art for all of that stuff. Now, unless you're me, I designed everything. If you caught the episode about Viking Age design work, well, I did all those Viking style designs for my wedding. And those weren't something you get stock designs for unless you know me. But yes, bridal and gift shop stuff, absolutely. Gift shop personalization, that kind of stuff, stock designs are absolutely on the menu and ready to rock. Resort wear, honestly, even though they do a lot of design work and they like to have interesting custom treatments in resort wear is frequently something that is themed to the area with a name of the place underneath it. And frequently enough, you can use stock for that, or you can create stock based on those themes to be used that way, especially if you have one region that is known for, let's say, palm trees. I'm not going to call out a region, but let's say your region has palm trees and we're making a few palm tree designs, and having them ready to dump different town names under them is not a problem there. So resort wear is another place it can be used. More and more resorts are doing custom stuff themselves, but it is a place that I did use some stock, and I have seen people use stock. Schools, I'm putting a little asterisk on there. We are past the era of schools just using all stock stuff. They are very likely to have a mascot, to have their own design work done. That way back in the day, lots of schools were using this stuff for sports. I would say schools and team sports, still to this day, you will get the classic athletic text that is above and below the picture of a ball. That is all the time happening in team sports. At least it has been for me. When there are people who are into that classic look, you're going to have people who are willing to use that stuff. And honestly, there are some motifs that are just good for stuff like team sports, schools, clubs, any place where the item, the theme is more important than the name, more important perhaps than the individual logo. But I'm going to say over the years, more and more and more of them have their own design work. So hence why I throw those asterisks on there. Very frequently, you're going to have some custom work involved, but what I'll say is generally I had a lot of custom pieces that I could use stock with, or that stock could become a portion of what I was doing. They could be part of the overall picture and part of the overall package. So stock design's pretty good for schools, pretty good for team sports. But here's the thing. Let's talk a little bit about the way stock designs are. And I called myself out earlier. As you see, this was actually my stock collection. That's the only Stitch.com where I have my piddly little collection of stock, which, by the way, not just yet, but I'm about to upload a couple more designs. Get ready. I do 2 every few years. I'm about to upload some more of those Viking Age designs that I talked about, guys. So I will have some up. But I called myself out by showing mine first. Let's go ahead and show you something from another user or another group that people use pretty frequently. And this is Urban Threads. And I was lucky to be around when Urban Threads kind of started and talk a lot to the people who were there. And they had some really great people in design and digitizing back then. And their work is pretty quality, right? So here's the thing, though. Despite the fact that their work is pretty quality, they're still not jumping in with this stuff in native formats for software. So it's not like you're going to go ahead and download something that's in the native formats, in the embroidery objects, so that when you stretch it and move it, it recalculates perfectly. Now, if you have software, like you guys know I work at Embrilliance. Embrilliance has software that recalculates on stitch by stitch basis without calculating objects, and it does recalculate density on fills and satins. You can get some recalculation, but even when you do that, there's going to be limited resizing. And why is that, right? Why is it there's limited resizing? Because we're going to make different design decisions based on the sizing of the art. We all know that we're working with thread, and the thread is a uniform thickness. It is an object. It is not going to change. So there are certain things that we do by stacking those stitches together. I talked about the only stitch, talked about motifs last week, and that all of these things, stitch types, are just stacking individual stitches together, these lines. Well, we talked about how you make thickness in a straight stitch line by doing multiple passes over the same area. Well, let's say if I do 2 passes of 40 weight thread, and I have a bunch of lines made out of those 2 passes of the thread at 1 inch tall, and now I make it 2 inches tall. Those lines are the same thickness they were when the thing was 1 inch tall. Now that it's 2 inches tall or 3 inches tall, I'm getting less density, even if I recalculate the fills and recalculate the satins, which is awesome. Any detail lines that I've drawn that look like an engraving style line, that look like black work, any of those lines are getting further apart, and the lines are thinner in relation to the rest of the design. So we are going to make different decisions about how small details can be, what details to include, and how large stitches can be, how long a satin stitch can be. We know there's an upper limit for the stitch length. We know there's a lower limit for how tight things can be, how short stitches can be. So we know that if we get too close to these limits for the longest stitch and the shortest stitch, same thing when we're talking about digitizing fonts or working with fonts, you're going to have issues with resizing. So immediately you're going to say, hey, limited resizing. So that's why there's some problems with stock designs. Of course there is. Why do these stock design sites all have, as you see in the image here, like 5, 6, 7, 8 sizes? Why do these stitch-based fonts have those sizes? Because even though there is some ability to resize, They're trying to release this thing from their initial work at these multiple sizes. And I'll tell you for a fact that if you look through all the different sizes, a really quality company, when they get down small, when they get really big, is going to make some alterations to their design, at the very least to their stitch types, in order to compensate for the problems that come with stretching and compressing a design a whole lot. So that's one of the things. The second thing is they are hard to edit. Now, once again, there are new things that I had not had back in the day. When I was originally editing designs, the only way to work on a stitch-based design was literally to grab individual stitch penetration points in software and move them. That was it. Sometimes you could select multiple stitches, but you had to select them in order, in sequence. You couldn't just grab or lasso a chunk of them. And you would actually have to do them in sequence, and then you could move that chunk of the design. Back in the day, there was absolutely nothing we could do. All we could probably do is rip the stitches out. And in fact, I've done a ton of this. You get a bad fill or a design that's got satin in it where you need a fill, and you rip that chunk of stitches out and you digitize the block inside of it and try and leave some other portion of the design alone. It's one of the things you can do with stock designs, but it also is a great deal of time spent. And it may be just like when we talk about digitizing glyphs instead of trying to look for fonts all day. It may be that it's less time to digitize something from scratch than to try and retool that thing. In any case, these are hard to edit. Now, like I said, there are new tools. Working with Embroidery, I was shocked to find out that we can select in one of our programs, you can select a block of stitches and say compensate, and it actually lengthens stitches. It knows the 2 points of a stitch and lengthens them. And I can compensate out issues. That's very new, at least very new to me. That's something that wasn't available before. But even then, all I can do some very light changes to stitch type. Like I said, this is only Brilliance I've seen this in, where I can grab stitches in a stitch-based file and change from like satin to a fill. But then I can't really modify them. I can't grab the edges of that shape and move it. I can't change the outline of something. I can do very small edits. I can maybe change the style of a stitch. I can do some compensation. So it's really cool if I have small edits to do. But if we're talking about massive resizing, replacing things in the design, I'm going to be digitizing something into it. And if you're not a digitizer, then this means that using the stock design probably wasn't all that worthwhile when you could have just gotten something custom done. So they're hard to edit. And I'll say this, stock designs, once again, is one of my things I always push. If you don't have personalization at the ready, you should. Good fonts, solid collection of fonts that you know run well, get those and have those and know that they're there. If you're someone who's going to use stock like a gift shop, if you're a personalization shop, you're already doing that. Monogram shops know this very well. They have collections of fonts that dwarf any I've had or made. But that's the thing. It's like stock designs, big deal, but best paired with personalization, because if you're using stock, we know it's generic. How do we get this thing to be personal again, despite the fact that it's not custom? Well, we customize it by adding text, and that's one of the best ways we can do it. But that's one of the things, right? We can talk about these different ways that we can handle these things. And like I said, these are the ways we want to go about it. One of the things, I showed this before, but you do want to find your favorite people who create stock. The reason I talk about Urban Threads is because most of their stuff is actually pretty well done. It's not super, super dense, and it's actually fairly decent. Like, it's not bad stock. I've had some stock back in the day. I won't name names, but there was a particular company that every time I used their stock, I knew I was in for thread breaks. And so when someone would bring me something that was their stock, I could take this off of my count of how many times I've used stock, because I would be redigitizing it almost every time, or I'd be replacing big pieces of it because it was so bad. Either too much coverage or not enough coverage almost uniformly. So you have to kind of know what people are working toward. But remember, the stock design creators cannot create specifically for one kind of fabric. So we're going to know, does this creator tend to have a heavy hand, tend to have a light hand, or do they have different designs if we go through them that actually are specified to have? Are they a dense design? Are they a light design? Are they made for a particular material? Are they made for a particular use? Of course, we're not going to get the range of every design in every style, every execution. It just isn't going to happen. However, we can look for people who are doing their best work. And I would say that's actually something that, like Urban Threads, why did I always show them back in the day? Because among the companies that were home style companies, they actually had some fairly decent stock designs that were digitized well. They were not digitized poorly. And I mean, even technically we're poor. And of course, the next thing, as always, when we're working on them, what did I say about resizing? You got to focus on your finished size. Invariably, if you just plop down a selection of designs in front of a customer, or if you yourself just look through the pictures and you don't scroll through looking for the designs, you're going to end up picking something too large, too small for your work. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to get real about this and say something that you're not supposed to say, right? It's not uniform. There's not one percentage. Everyone tells you, how much can I resize a stock embroidery design? Somebody says, oh, no more than 15%, no more than 25. I've been somebody who's said this before. The truth of the matter is it's absolutely dependent on the design. Designs that have black work or detail or shading where they're done in single straight stitches, as you get larger, it gets less dense. They look weedy, they look thin, they look too light. You have to know how much space you can add in between these detail lines, how thin these lines can get before they start looking like that. Designs that have big, wide satin stitches in them at their standard size, if you start blowing them up, you will get too wide. I love this. Justin says, I think it's 13.6839. He's making fun because he's a digitizer and he knows this. If I go and find a design that is a straight-edged, very cleanly made varsity letter with a medium-sized satin stitch border, let's say that I have a filled varsity letter with a 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeter satin stitch border, and I've got that thing made for a pocket. Let's say that I have the original file, the working file, not the stitch file, but the stitch file, depending on your software, can do a lot. But let's say I have the working file. I could absolutely grab that thing and I could stretch it 10x. Why? Because all it has is in a fill is one fill that's defined for the area. It might have some pull compensation issues, but the likelihood is that the fill is about halfway into the satin stitch. It would be a little inefficient. But when I blew it up, what I would end up with is a 10 millimeter huge fat satin border on a big filled letter. If there were no details in it and I haven't gone too far for these satin stitches to, be too wide. Now that one, if the corners are at 45-degree angles, it'd be too long. Let's say not 10x. Let's say, hey, 5x. Why not? But still, it's a massive amount. It's 500%. It's not 10%, it's not 25%. Will it run? Yeah, it probably will if I'm using the original file so it can recalculate the stitches, recalculate the underlay correctly. Yes, I can. The thing is, it is few and far between that we have designs that are so bomb-proof that they'll do that. And the other thing we have is text or designs that have compensation. We all know about push and pull compensation, right? When we're at the open ends of columns, they're going to push out a little bit. When we're at the closed sides of columns, they're going to pull in. Well, we know that we're looking at, say, a row of text, which is something that's pretty common in designs, or if we just have a row of details that are different shapes that have these different things on them, we're going to compensate, especially push compensation is a big one that we can't do a lot about. Push compensation, if we've decided that we toe in about 0.4 millimeters or 0.8 millimeters, depending on how much push compensation we need for the kind of fabric we're working on, and then we blow something up, that compensation now, instead of being a couple rows of stitching, we blow it up 10x is now a big chunk. And what we're going to find out is that our open ends are going to come up short, and they're not going to be even rows of text that they were, because the same push compensation is probably needed. We're not going to stretch in a much different way from that smaller size to the larger size. And when we blow up, we need different levels of compensation. So these things are going to be issues once we get past a certain point. That's where that 15-25% comes in. The truth of the matter, though, is it's more important, instead of having a percentage to look at, to actually be able to understand what in the design requires you to make different decisions. And what are the things that require you to make different decisions about how a design is made? Well, the thickness of lines. If we have really thin lines, we know that we get to a point that they're too thin for a satin stitch. And when we do, we often go with a straight stitch or with a bean stitch. And when we do these things, invariably that straight or bean stitch, those things do not change unless we put thicker thread on them. So unless we add more passes, which is digitizing or editing, not what we're talking about here. If we just blow a design up, even if we recalculate the fills and satins, we are still going to end up with any motifs, any straight stitches, bean stitches, being thinner as we get bigger and being thicker as we go smaller in relation to the design themselves. So thickness of lines is a big thing. Compensation is a big thing. Overlap, pull compensation is really what we're talking about, but that overlap does change, and we do get to a point where we have too much or too little. If we have something that starts out big with just a little bit of compensation and we shrink it down, even if the rest of the stitches are the right sizes, we don't have as much overlap as we did at the larger size, and we might not have enough compensation for pull. So those are the things we have to look out for. Also, like I said, always look for your longest stitches and your shortest stitches. We have a tapered end on something, unless we are automatically filtering those out, and we might not like the look of that. We need to look at the tapered end of a stroke on a letter and say, as it gets smaller and smaller, the tapered end of some detail, we're going to get that really small stitch at the end. We run a bunch of little tiny stitches together, and that is a way to end up breaking thread for sure. So tiny stitches or overly long stitches. Let's say we have something that has nice wide satins in it. We blow it up. We're going to end up with long, loopy, easily snagged stitches, even if your machine is tolerant of them. And they're going to change the texture and the look of the garment. So percentages don't matter nearly so much as understanding what details we're going to do when we blow them up or shrink them, what we're going to get out of the smallest and largest stitches, and how our compensation is going to look at the different size. So can I tell you 15% or 25%? It's a good rule of thumb so that you don't go crazy. Can you do more than that with the right design? Absolutely. Absolutely you can. The right design, simple design that doesn't have a lot of compensation, or let's say it's a single item that isn't registered to anything else, then all we're really looking at is shortest stitch, longest stitch, and maybe a little bit of compensation. That's it. Other than that, and unless they are then registered or they're just related to their objects instead of registered, then we're looking at compensation to make sure everything comes out the right heights, the right evenness, lines are straight. But other than that, we're not going to have to worry about overlap. We're not going to have to worry about pull and push in that kind of way. And then we're looking at, once again, longest stitch, shortest stitch, and that's going to help us know what we're doing. Unless, of course, like I said, once you have details, once you have shading, once you have outlining, once you have those engraving like little lines, now we really have to worry about thickness of line, the closeness of details. Because once again, if we have details that look like this at one size, as we get smaller and smaller and those lines stay the same thickness, what are we doing? We're making fills. We're making fully filled areas. We're going to occlude the background because as they get closer and closer together, we see less and less daylight behind them. We see less and less of the actual design that was underneath them or of the background or of the fabric. And eventually they become fills. Once they get close enough together to be the same density as a full fill for the thread you're using, it's a fill no matter how it started. So a good way to think about it, yes, you can resize stock designs to some degree, especially if you have software like the software we have that does recalculate fills, recalculate satins. Absolutely, you can do that. However, you're still going to run into the problems with details, problems with your longest stitch, your shortest stitch, unless you're doing something to change those stitch types or break them up or split satins, things like that. You can do that, but then we're also changing the texture of the design and the underlay may not hold up to it. So we have to think about that. We might see some more show through if we suddenly change to a fill or a split satin, but we didn't underlay in a way that's going to help support that. You may see some quality change. So that's what we're talking about. When someone tells you you can only resize stock 15%, 25%, can be true. Good rule of thumb. However, it's more about the choices digitizers have to make. And that's why we're talking about it. I mean, that's why it gets bandied about. I think people give you the percentage because they don't want to deal with the fact that people really want to blow things up huge. As you may have seen, and I think I even still have this, I had this in my branding, so I'll do this. One does not simply blow up a cap design for a jacket back. Because most of the time, the detail work that's being done for a cap design at 2 inches is not going to play well at 10. And that's the thing. We make very different decisions as to how much detail we put in and how little detail we can get away with when we're working at really small sizes compared to big sizes. So working at size is a big deal, whether you're digitizing or whether you're working with stock designs yourself. So let's go back into what we were talking about here. So the next thing we have to think about, take care of your stitch counts. When we are discussing stock design, stitch counts can often be pretty high. We can get a lot of density in a lot of these designs because they are made for what I always call like ideal target material. For me back in the day when I did stock, usually it was, by the way, I like this. Jeff says this, I'm a little punchy, so here's comments coming in. I just want to shrink the jacket back to a hat, simple. You know, I have had a lot of people ask me to do it. And I've actually had people ask me to shrink a jacket back design all the way for the top over an arch on the back of the hat. And I literally laughed and then had to pull myself back because I realized they were serious. But yes, boom. Got to use that old meme and really date myself. But oh well, can't help it, guys. Suffice it to say, when we're working with stock designs, sizing is a big deal, but sizing is also a big deal because of stitch counts and densities. And fairly frequently, whether we're talking about compressing a bunch of small detail together until there's too much density because we're puncturing over and over in the same spots, that's one thing that can happen if we start shrinking things down. The other problem is we often have with stock designs, like I said, we're set for an ideal garment. And back in the day, what I was told and what I worked toward was essentially full coverage on a cotton piqué polo shirt, which means something that is lightly textured. It's a knit with some stretch, and I need to fully cover with a fair amount of contrast. That was the target that we were kind of taught to work to when we didn't know when something was going to be used on what. And as a commercial digitizer, you did it to a degree too, when you thought you were going to have to reuse a design on multiple garments and you didn't want to do a bunch of editing. Now, truthfully, I always like to edit. I got in trouble for making more and more versions of designs because I wanted to make them as good as I could no matter what. But the truth of the matter is, sometimes you just go for that target. And when you get a tissue tee or you get a really light piece of material or somebody brings in, their silk shirt and asks you to embroider on it, well, those stitch counts are not going to hold up. And you're going to find out, especially, like I said, people will go take stock designs and try to put them on satin sashes for pageants or something like that. And that satin is just not going to take that immense amount of density. Even very skilled people, won't say who it was, but there was somebody who I was talking about too recently, somebody over in the UK who does fashion work, awesome fashion work and decor and embroidered wallpaper, really cool stuff. And she was working on this satin and it was just giving her fits. And this is somebody who is skilled and artistic and awesome. And they're asking my old commercial butt to help them out with satin, because when you use too much density, it's very hard to deal with. And I'll actually give Brian Bailey, Creative and Brilliance, who by the way should also be very tired today. This is his equation for that. Stock equals full coverage equals bulletproof. And I'll say, working with people in home decor and also in the home decoration market, you find out that they are willing to put up with, and I'll say it that way because for our commercial people is often the case, they're willing to put up with a slightly lower coverage than we are. Whereas when you're dealing with corporate colors, they're frequently very unhappy if they're not getting complete and total full coverage that is in the color that's set in the Pantone book. They're going to be unhappy. If they're seeing any show through the background garment, even under magnification, they're unhappy. Whereas you look at home decor, just once, go into the throw pillow aisle of whatever expensive home decor store you can find and go look at the levels of coverage and embroidery that you'll see there, and you'll know what I'm talking about. It's 50%. It's nowhere near 0.4 mils with 40 weight thread. And honestly, when you look at designs, even if you look at my designs, the stock designs are going to be heavier. When you look at my designs for corporate work, I was always trying to use more underlay, less coverage. The problem is, when you look at stock designs, that is often not the case. So when you do buy a stock design, when you start into a company and you want to see if this is a good company, look at the weight they're working with. Fairly frequently, I have seen stock design companies uniformly come in what I would consider 25% above full coverage. No lie, almost all of their fills are at 3 points or 0.3 millimeters, which is incredibly heavy for 40 weight thread, which is what they say that they're made for. But the truth of the matter is that is very heavy. That is 25% more coverage than I want to see. It's huge. And I've seen that over and over and over again. And especially because they will do that kind of coverage on a single layer and then layer details on top of that at full coverage over and over. And you get 3, 4, 5 layers of full coverage in some areas. And you have to be very careful with that kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely look at that. And that's the thing. And yeah, no, here's what Brian says. Eric, you can teach coverage without rigidity in a design. Stock designers are often just getting the work out. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they are working toward that target. So what you're going to find is that even the good ones in a flat fill with nothing above it are trying to put in a fair amount of coverage. They often are because they get callbacks on stuff that has low coverage, especially the ones who are doing stuff for corporate work. But absolutely, you can cover without rigidity. Like I always say, it's underlay, structural work, and then less coverage on top. But stock designers are cranking stuff out. And like I said, sometimes a stock designer, you'll have a room full of people who is contracted to make stock designs and they dump a category on them because we're going to release big chunks of stock. And those folks are just going to have to do it, right? And yeah, there we are. We have to face the end customer. Department stores don't call it the embroiderer. Yeah, true. That's true. You're not doing that quite the same way. But what I'll say is, and Ramona says this, lots of big names in stock use over density. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. I hate to say that. In fact, what I used to do back in the day sometimes was get a smaller size and resize it without calculation. So think about that for a minute. I would decrease the density of a design by getting it at a smaller size, telling the customer to be at a slightly larger size, and resizing it without calculation. That would reduce the density because I'm increasing the space between the stitches. So if everything's uniformly over, that's a trick you can use. But the truth of the matter is you may have to use something like we have a program that actually repairs density repair kit. Why is there a program that needs to be there for repairing density? Because there are stock designs full of density like that. Brian spent his time coding an entire piece of software because the realm of stock designs is so commonly over density. So anyway, let's get past that. Let's go to the next stage of this. And the other thing we want to look for here, and I apologize, this is really small, but here, good pathing and sequencing. This is another thing that is often missing. Pathing and sequencing, you'll see lots and lots and lots of color changes. If you've got a place where they are really for the home market, a lot of the time they're going to use many more colors than you would use in a commercial range. And if you're not making masterpieces that are being charged for at the rates that you need to demand to do all this work, then, you know, you might want to think about that twice. Also, good pathing is as well. Frequently, you're not going to see great use of pathing. So you're going to have jumps and trims everywhere. And as we always know, trimming is a big deal. Jumping is a big deal. If you're going to have a thread pull out, you're going to have a break, you're going to have to rethread, you're going to have a pause. That's going to happen during that jump and trim and lock sequence. So it's definitely something you have to look out for. I would say invariably good pathing and sequencing. Look at the apparent motion in these designs and see if they're good. One of the great ways we can do this, by the way, one tip here, go check out the free designs from your stock design creators. They almost always have free designs. Go look at the free designs, get them into your software, get out that measuring tool. Like I tell you all the time, punch that M key, get that ruler out and start measuring densities, measuring stitch lengths, and watch the stitch simulators. Watch the simulator so you can see it, do a simulated run and see all the directions that it's moving, see the apparent motion, see the path design, because it'll run quicker, lay flatter, be a better design if they're doing the sequencing, doing the pathing right. Proper use of underlay. Quite frankly, you're going to have a random range of underlay usage. I have seen everything from just mass global underlays everywhere to absolutely none, even when it makes a great deal of sense. Just check it out. Look at their underlay. If you don't understand underlay, go back and check out some of my articles about underlay, or maybe I'll have to teach another one. But frankly, underlay is not always being very well used, and definitely structural use of underlay is not happening all the time. So think about the structural use of underlay, and remember that we're in a three-dimensional mode here where we are building a foundation with our underlay on top of which we're laying our stitches. It's why a lot of underlay is perpendicular to the top stitching direction. It's because we are building little rails and we're laying our top stitching on top of it, and we get a little bit of color coverage from the actual color of the underlay, and we get it lifting away from the surface because we're building up that platform underneath it, and we can use less top stitching that way. So if you see people using good structural underlay, absolutely look into it. I'll say one caveat for that. People who are good at lace, their underlay is awesome because it has to be, or they're going to get calls because they're going to have their stuff fall apart when it washes out. But yeah, proper use of underlay is something to look for. Overlaps and compensation. Once again, if you are getting poor stock, if you are buying a giant 10,000 pack of embroidery files, the likelihood is they've been auto-digitized, and at the very worst, they may have been literally converted from vector that has no overlaps, no compensation, no planning for the actual embroidery process. All it has is stitches applied to shapes. I'm not saying this is all stock design creators. Like I said, go look at the free stock designs from each of the creators, and the people who have them will show you their quality. You can see what's there. And honestly, as cheap as stock designs are, go find something that's in the category that you might use. If you're an outdoors person, go find the bugling elk head of your choice and buy one for yourself and run it and look at it and see what kind of quality they have, and find your favorite person who's, you know, or your favorite digitizing group. Now, sometimes they have different people doing it for them. But if it is a company producing their own stock, that's a different thing. You go to those big clearinghouses too that just have embroidery designs from everyone. You have to really scrutinize who's doing the work and look at the previews of the work before you buy it, because just because it has the design you need doesn't mean it's going to have the quality you need. And frankly, there is a ton of auto digitizing being passed off as stock design work. And a lot of it has very little overlap, almost no compensation, and almost to a fault is done in ways where the stitch angles don't enhance the embroidery, don't make it look better, and where a lot of the stitch types don't make sense. So check that out. Look at the way this is made, and if you have good designs that you know and you love, analyze those like crazy. Look at what you love about them and look for stock creators that are doing the same kind of thing. So overlaps and compensation, super huge stuff. And like I said, this is just, it's not that you can't use stock. Stock's great, and I've used stock in good ways. Plus, like I said, people who have gift shops, especially, stock designs can be great. They can be fantastic. But here's the thing. We all know about resizing causing issues. We all know that sometimes they're not doing the things they should in their design work. And we definitely know that stock designs, especially when we're just getting these kind of shovelware stock designs that are in these big categories of thousands, are not in the kind of quality they should be to represent what we do as embroiderers well. So once again, I'm going to go back over resizing one more time because we have a couple of things just to show you examples of the stuff I already said. But think about it again. Think about who you're getting designs from. the quality that they run, and do some testing for yourself. Sampling is worthwhile, and doing some analysis, the same way you would do if you were learning something, if you were working on a design that wasn't working, do some preliminary analysis and do some testing on designs, especially when they have free designs. And it is both something that you can use if you know what you're doing. It's something where you can test what they're doing to see if it's going to work out, to see if they've got their chops right, or if you find out that they're a good design, they're designs that run well, and you don't know what you're doing, bonus number one of the things you can do with great stock designs and with free stock designs is learn digitizing, because you can see how they interpreted shapes, how they use stitches, how they use texture, how they overlap, how they compensate. And if you measure every little thing about it, you can bite a little bit of their style. You can take that style that they use to create things, and you can make it your own by understanding stitch angles, underlay types, stitch lengths, densities, overlaps, compensation, which all of these things you can measure with the measuring tool in your software and replicate in doing your own work. Let's talk one more time about resizing. I think it's important enough when we're talking about stock. So decisions change a lot about stitch type and settings, as you know, even working files. So even if we had working or native files, still makes a difference. Smallest stitcher space, largest stitcher space can make a difference. But this is the thing I wanted to show you really quickly. Even though this is a digital preview, you can see the relative density. Up on the upper left-hand corner here is an engraving style design that I did. And you guys may have seen it. I did it with some matte finish thread, and it's a really fine design, runs very well. The thing is, if you look at all that fine detail that's in it, if you go up or down 25%, look at the relative kind of darkness and density of the design itself and how much different it looks. Look how much less clarity I have on the upper right-hand side. I've only gone down 25%. We're not going past the magic percentages it tells you to check out. But what you can see is a bunch of the stuff that had a little bit of spacing inside of it has now become a fill, has now become solid, and now no longer has the charm it did when it was a little more open. And conversely, though I think it looks a little less upsetting, when you blow it up, the really small details like the small text on the sign and some of the other small details and areas that are in the design get too open and too samey. The contrast is lost because the spacing means I don't have quite the same amount of tightness or contrast or darkness in some of the areas. And so we lose a little bit of the depth of the thing, and we start to see some of the dirty little secrets of pathing you use to get from area to area, because I don't have these little tiny stitches I'm jumping across from element to element anymore. They're long enough to see, they're long enough to notice. And so now all of those things we did, the tricks we do for pathing, the tricks we do to travel through a design, maybe how you have a bunch of little straight stitches, as you know, to make a curve. Well, if I only use 3 or 4 to get over a curve, because at a small size, those 3 or 4 stitches look like a curve. When I blow it up, now it looks like a big polygon. These things can change even at small changes. Like I said, 25% is enough. Also, longest, shortest stitches, you look at this, a capped or a full continuous serif, a capped font is also very much the same. You're going to see that when you have these big wide caps like this, or wide serifs, this satin stitch has already turned into jump cycles over on the right-hand side at this size. And if you have a font made for very small uses, fairly frequently the serifs are going to be full width satins like this, and those serifs are going to pop up. And that makes the same sense for any design. You're going to end up with these long ka-chunk, as we made the joke, stitch cycles that end up happening because of those big open long satins. So resizing is risky. Sorry to go past that. I didn't take it out of the rest of the slide deck, but this is something to think about when we're talking about stock designs too. That's that longest stitch, that's that shortest stitch, that's the small detail, that's the really long stitches coming out to bite you when you scale up and scale down. So percentages don't do it, but understanding the stitches, that'll do it. That'll help you get where you need to go. So I talked about some of the other things we can do, and actually in the initial article that we have here, there's a little piece that I did. And once again, I talked about selecting stock and how we use them. That piece over on the right-hand side, I actually selected a piece of stock. Some of it's custom, some of it's stock. This piece that I did has a lot of custom work, but has some stock flowers built into it. And it was something where I could tear it apart and use it. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about. Getting the most out of stock designs is sometimes understanding how to manipulate what you have. If you know you can work with it at the right size, and if the design itself isn't so complicated you can't tear it apart, or it's very easy for you to select pieces of it and pop them off or use them in different ways, sometimes stock can be very useful. This particular project that I had over here, I had this floral spray that was part of a design, and I had to get a bunch of different flowers for it. I was digitizing like crazy, and the person did not care about the flowers. They just wanted a certain color range, a certain type of look. So instead of digitizing the entire bouquet of flowers, I did a couple pieces that were from the bouquet, and then I took similar stock design flowers and edited and used those because I could process those down. So using stock designs, we can use them in different ways than they're intended to be used, because if we understand how they're pathed and we understand what sizes they can take and what we can do to resequence them, we can then take them apart and use them. And in this particular case, it's because I had a client that had a realistic floral bouquet that was not going to look good. It looks like hamburger. It just isn't enough clarity in the original image, and they wanted something that had more clarity and that was designed, but they didn't have any design work themselves, and we were not about to redraw an entire bouquet of flowers. Instead, I could use some stock pieces that go together with some custom pieces that harken back to the original art, and that made this work. Now, this was a big custom jacket bag that I was paid quite a bit to do. So that kind of editing and futzing is sometimes not worthwhile if you don't have the time to work on it. But when you do have a big piece that we can do some of this work on, when someone has a concept, once again, but doesn't have art, sometimes that stock means you can go straight to the stitch point without saying, here's the art, and we're going to have this other look first. Sometimes when we're working directly for embroidery, and this piece was made to be embroidered, it was never just made to be reproduced art in print, we can go straight to the embroidered end result and show that so that people understand the texture, understand what's going on. So some of the other things I put on here, and it's actually, I had a little sidebar in this one. Some of the cool things you can do with stock, absolutely applique conversion. One of my favorite things to do with a piece of stock where I blow it up and I don't like all the fill stitch I have in there is to take, often there's an underlay run or something that's a contour run, and we can use that to make applique. Back in the day, I had to digitize it myself to do this, or I had to throw applique in there and futz with it and cut it. These days, actually, in Brilliance, even in the Essentials software, allows you to take a row of stitching, a placement run, and actually make a cut file directly from it and put a contour on it so I can expand that cut file. So I have tools that do it easier now, but back in the day, I used to do it manually. Take a piece out and use the biggest, flattest color that's in the background of whatever piece it is as an applique. Great thing to do. Patch making. I knew a ton of people who made a fair amount of money, actually, making custom patches for folks where they were just taking a stock design and ringing it top and bottom with text and having a nice patch border on the outside. And decorated patches with stock designs, believe it or not, can be a lucrative thing to make, especially if you get stock that makes sense for the category. One of the ones that I really loved is somebody did a bunch of faux merit badges for companies, where the company would have different tasks or different things they did. And luckily, a lot of the things that these companies have are generic enough that you could use stock designs for the central matter of the patch, and they just had custom text. So central design, custom text, or a patch border, which, by the way, even stock design companies have patch borders for making patches yourself. Throw those things together, and suddenly we have these patches that are really awesome. Creating art for prints, you can output. A great thing we just did, I told you guys that in Brilliance released at 1.165, we have a new way of doing our outputting these really high resolution PNG files, transparent PNG files. I've seen a lot of people lately, especially with DTG machines, with also heat transfer machines, sublimation, they have been printing out the 3D previews from embroidery and using those for prints. And I did this back in the day when I first started desktop sublimation. Really cool to take a stock design and make that into an embroidered texture, and sometimes to even use that as texture in something else. Some of these faux stitched images are really pretty cool. So just preview images may do cool, may do pretty well, but you may want to have something like that high-res generator or something that does a like I said, a transparent image that you can actually use it over top of something else. Very cool for digital printing. The people over at Equipment Zone famously did it at the trade shows with an embroidered arm patch, a classic flag patch, and they were throwing that on shirts and people just loved them. And sometimes for the right customer, when they can't afford embroidery on everything, having the ability to do that faux stuff is pretty cool. And like I said, this is one of the best things you can do with stock. You find somebody who's really good at stock, or let's say they have an artistic style that you really want to work on. One of the big ones for this, you find somebody who does really great animal or nature work, get that design and study it, because that's something that really has a hand to it. It has almost the brush strokes of the master are available there. Measure the lines, look how it's put together, look how it's layered, look at the color selections that are there, and work it out. Learn to digitize from stock designs. High quality stock designs are absolutely a fantastic way to learn because you can edit them, you can take them apart, you can measure all the pieces, and you can run them on your machine immediately. And all of these things give you incredibly valuable information and experience. It's going to make you a better embroiderer and a better digitizer. Absolutely. Let's go from that. Let's talk about some other stuff real quick. I wanted to show you just a couple other fun things. The 3 top tabs I talk about for making stock designs. I've got more and more people now who are making stock designs. And the first thing I'm going to say about this is if you are not happy with the quality of your embroidery yet, then you shouldn't probably be making stock designs yet. And I don't mean this to call somebody out. I don't have anybody specific here. I've got some folks who, however, have asked me day one, they're like, I want to learn to digitize. I want to make stock designs. And I asked them, all right, well, what kind of, are you a digitizer already? Because they're usually asking me about software questions, about how to use software, what software to get, things like that. And invariably they stop and say, oh no, I want to learn to digitize. I'm going to make a line of stock designs. And I stop and say, all right, well, part of this issue first, you have to learn to digitize pretty well to have the kind of control that makes great stock designs. You're going to need to learn to digitize and embroider first. I always say an operator makes the best digitizer. Graphic designers are fantastic for doing art interpretation. And there's nothing wrong with starting out from the art side of this thing, but you need to get your hands dirty. You need to come home with thread on your clothes in order to really do this the best way you can. And that is home, that is commercial, that is anything. You need to get on a machine, watch it run, understand how the machine works, and know what's that interaction I always talk about. We've got that holistic interaction: file, thread, fabric, stabilizer, machine. And we also have operation. We have the speed at which we operate, the way we hoop. So it's the materials, it's the work we do, it's the file, and it's holistic. And the way to understand that is to experience it, or at least the way to get it below your lower jaw, to understand it more than just daydreaming, right? So that's one of the things I talk about with stock designs. But some of the other things I talk about is copyright infringement. I'm not going to get deep into this, guys, but let's just say this. If you're making designs and you know that the design would be worth nothing unless someone else's property or invention or book or movie or TV show was around to make it interesting, if the design itself has no value to it unless someone knows what it is from something else, you might have some infringement on your hands. It's not always the case. Everybody will say to me, oh, what about how many degrees can I change something? It doesn't work at all, because one of the things that I will say is protected is derivative works. Derivative works is specifically that. And I will say, yeah, Jeff is absolutely right about this with art. Licensing is a pain sometimes. Yeah. Look for licensing. And I'll say I've had to turn stuff away before. I've had designs I really wanted to do from people's art where I go and contact them and say, hey, I'd like to do a stock design. They say, well, are you going to redistribute it? I said, no, I'm going to distribute a version of it that I'm going to do in embroidery. So it's an interpretation. It's now embroidery. It's not your design anymore. It's my embroidered interpretation. And even with that explanation attached to it, where I'm like, no, they're not going to be able to make another designed work from it. A lot of artists don't like that. So even with enhanced commercial licensing, you may not be able to use stuff. So you have to be careful about copyright infringement. And I call myself out on this because I made for a friend of mine many years ago. So it's in software I don't use anymore very much. And it's got this is from, I think this is from the movie Prometheus, the whole Aliens franchise. I had a friend of mine who was going in costume to the opening of Prometheus, and he was super jazzed because knowing an embroiderer means that you can go with part of the costume to the launch of the movie before any merch is out. So I made one piece for a friend of mine, did not sell it, did not redistribute it, and it was stitched once. However, that's not what you're going to do if you're making stock designs. And if you see stock like this, you buy stock like this, you're kind of feeding into it. Just know that's what's going on. I would like to tell you that it's not worth it. And especially there are big names that we all know. Harley, Disney, just don't. Harley, Disney, NFL, don't do it. Just don't do it. It's not worth it, because you can lose your shop. Go look up the news. I don't have to tell you. You can lose your shop. You can lose a lot of money just in the fight. Even if you're right, you can lose money in the fight. So truthfully, I don't like to mess around with that. I like to use a lot of original or freely licensed art. And here I called myself out one more time. I always make fun of myself when I'm going to make fun of anybody. I said, yeah, does anybody else want Raven Skull art? Because I drew this myself for my own work. No, nobody else? Raven Skull stock designs, raise your hand. So yeah, I make some weird stuff that ends up on my website, but using original art and sketching stuff, or using completely commercial free art, stuff that is in the absolute public domain, not just something that's on Google, something that is licensed either as being in the public and available for commercial stuff, is important. It's not that there aren't ways around it. It's not that there aren't laws that are different depending on the kind of thing you're making. However, when we're talking about most stuff that's mascots, most stuff that you might want that people have, video game characters, stuff like that, yes, somebody might not have deep enough pockets to chase you, but if you're wondering if it's infringing, it probably is. This is another one too, and I'm not going to say I don't do this. To some degree, I have done this before. If you have poor example images, it's okay to use some. And by the way, here's Jewel says this, and I don't know legality. I am not a lawyer, and I'll say that now. She says exactly $10,000 per design they can sue for. Wow. See, that's not worth it. So if they can do that, also lost revenue. You don't ever want to get dinged for that, or to just pick up their court case costs, right? But people don't want that, so don't do it. This is the other thing, example images. If your image is not coming off right, best way always is to use stitches to do it. Sometimes I've seen, and I think this is a fine way to do it, digital images supported by some project images or some example images. You can't always do everything one-to-one. I like to do them one-to-one when I can. So stitched images are great, but no matter what you do, just be careful of like low contrast images or images that aren't carrying across the whole manner. I would say this particular design of mine, I just did not love how it looked in the 3D, so I tend to stitch them out and use my stitch outs as part of the sampling. Plus, the thing is, if you haven't sampled it ever, or you don't know how it's working, you might want to sample it, especially if you're just starting out. You can't be justified in saying you know for sure it's going to work. Somebody with a lot of experience maybe can, not everybody can. So it's one of those things where I'm on the fence on this one. I've got fonts and stuff I've made that I have not sampled out, and I know they're going to run because they're very simple. There's nothing that's going to go wrong with them. If I had a design that I also just wanted to show off some of these textural things, this is a very simple looking design that has a lot of texture in the thread. Makes sense to make a good image out of it. And also designs without context. That's another thing too. If you don't create or tag your designs or have different things that you have that are in specific to the context, it's going to be hard to sell them. And what I'll say about stock design selling and just putting stuff together is that sometimes designs just, you can get away with them being generic and for everything, but you do have to be very clear on what they are, and you have to feed the Google monster and make sure it's easy to find them for what they are. So definitely think about that when you're making stock designs. You have to have appeal to the range of people who you think are going to buy them. There has to be a market for them. You can't just decide, like I have all those Viking Age designs. I know I'm never going to make a mint on Viking Age stock designs. It's a weird niche. There are certain people who love them very much and are willing to pay for them. I'm glad that I can do them pretty much as a hobby for fun, for testing out things that I want to work on. The truth of the matter is I know that I'm not going to be making a mint on those because they don't have broad spectrum appeal. The problem is if they have broad spectrum appeal, if they're too broad, the likelihood is you're also in a place with a lot of competition. So you're always going to be weighing competition versus, whether or not there's enough in the long tail for you to stop and make the designs, because designs are only worth making in stock land if you're going to be paid enough over time on each design to make up for your digitizing you would have done custom, right? To make up for the time that it takes. And I will say that pretty frequently it has not panned out for me in that way. But I've also made some very niche stuff. I've made some niche designs. Sometimes you'll get them paid off immediately because you find that you are so niche that people are willing to pay a lot because it's an underserved market. So there is a weird little U shape in here to talk about, right? You can have things that where it's there's too many people doing it. And so you're competing, you're a small fish in a big pond. You get down to this lower area where it's like, yeah, there's some other people competing. There's just not that much traffic for it, but there is some choice, and there's enough choice that they may not choose you, but it also isn't broad spectrum appeal, so you're not going to get a lot of small purchasers. And then you have the other side where it ramps back up, where you are the only person who's ever made this stuff, and there is a small, passionate group of people who want it, and then those people are willing to pay more per usage, and then you might be able to just literally charge more because you have especially if it's high quality, if it's made well, you have a desirable thing for an underserved market. So it's a weird little U shape on stock designs on how you can make money with them or where it's worthwhile to do these. Invariably, it's one thing to think about. And I'll say one of the ones that I had that was the most successful was actually these. Because actually, I made these designs, these folk art designs for folk instruments, and they were made very specifically. They're in context. The style is very much in appealing to this particular group of people who played folk instruments. And actually, I started out, as you guys may know from other articles I've done about niche marketing, I made these tote bags. These were created entirely for the tote bags. They were not made as stock designs originally. So that was the thing. Originally, I made them for a purpose. They had a place they went. They were made for a particular kind of material, certainly, though because we're on canvas, you can get away with a lot. There's not a lot that you have to worry about aside from fine detail and problems with coarse material. But that's one of those things where it's like, this is a small market, but not too small. I had a wide enough range of designs that multiple different kinds of people they were underserved, but they had some money to spend. These are musicians. If you know a musician, they sometimes pay a little for their gear. So it was something where underserved market, other people didn't understand what was there. I was making designs that didn't exist. You couldn't find them anywhere else. And invariably what ended up happening is, though I was selling these tote bags and made enough to keep myself employed for some time doing this during an incredible economic downturn. What ended up happening in the end with these is, for a while now, they're not currently in my stock. I haven't put them back up because I actually think technically they need some help. And many of these were made in softwares I can no longer access. Some of these actually come from my old original DOS-based software, and you'll actually notice some of them were made. I had an era where I was working in Melco Design Shop many years ago. And you can see that this motif stitching that's here, if you know Melco Design Shop, is actually a stock motif that's out of there. I used this motif to fill out the area, because some of the designs were very small, like the dulcimers were very small, and they needed something else aside from the text that I added to them up here to make them look a little more interesting. And so I used these little leaf motifs, but that's actually from a piece that's directly out of the software. And what I'll say is, further down the road, what ended up happening is a bunch of quilters, old home quilters, wanted these designs to make musical instrument quilts. And that was a big deal, both as instrument covers for things like these hammered dulcimers, which sit on a stand, and for groups of folk musicians. And so when that kind of got out for a little while, there was a small pocket of time where these people who were very interested, especially we had the dulcimer, so Appalachian music, so mountain music down south, there was a group of people who were into quilting, into embroidery, and knew people who played these instruments and were passionate about it. And for a little while there, they became a stock design collection. I ripped out that motif stitch so that I no longer had something that belonged to somebody else. And the rest of these, I drew a lot of the art for these, or I took photographs of actual instruments and digitized directly on top of the photographs. And these pieces were done for stock. What I am going to tell you is, one of the reasons I don't have them on for stock now, aside from the fact that I technically think they need to be updated, is that some of these designs, they really have a very tight limit for size. We have really small details. You see the pegs on the tuner head on this dulcimer, really small details, fine lines. A lot of those, the little steel strings or bronze strings were, the wound strings were made with straight stitches, and they do look a little stitchy, a little patchy. Works all right because we're talking about a fretted instrument, so it kind of looks a little bit like frets or something like that. Works okay, but it's a little stitchy, a little patchy. And the thing is, these really are not as versatile as I would like them to be for stock designs. Now, could they be sold like this? Absolutely. Do they work? Yeah, they stitch out pretty well. And the people who had them loved them dearly because they just, at the time especially, this is in an era where there's no Amazon, where there's stock design collections online were limited literally to the top 3 that you may know from back in the day. There was no Etsy. So when I made these, it was incredibly niche and incredibly interesting to these people because they had never seen the pieces before. And when they literally approached me, because I had them on these embroidered pieces on these bags, saying, where did you get these designs? We've never seen such a thing. Can these be made for the home market? Can they be made for home machines? And at the time, I didn't really know. I had to go back around and find out all about it. So my first, and I'll say this too, everybody who says like, oh, commercial embroiderer and you've never kind of been in the home market. My first taste of the home market was really early, in that I was making these designs for home market quilters. The thing is, that became a thing for a while, and that's the deal. It really worked out where, in this particular usage, where a scatter of small designs on the quilt was what they wanted, they really enjoyed it, really loved it. But these, like I said, they are not, even knowing that we've got them right here, they are not as versatile as I would like them. And because I can no longer access the original work files, I'd pretty much have to recreate the entire collection if I was going to do it again. And I couldn't do those as native. Now we're getting into bonus time. I have maybe a couple things I'd like to share before we get done here. So we have other things that I got to get to, and I don't want to go too long into bonus time, but I do have a couple more little things. Number one, I'd love to bring up a comment here from Ramona, because I think it's a great comment. So let me get her over here. Ramona says, I have one design file that actually launched my business back 7 years ago. It was sweet. It made that mint, or mint enough anyways. You know what? You never know. You never know where you're going to go from that kind of stuff. I'll say that for me, literally a summer job hucking boxes around in the back of a truck turned into operating embroidery machines, turned into the entirety of my career. And I had absolutely no plans to do this. So sometimes doing this sort of stuff, if you love it, if you have a passion for that stock design set, like hey, it could have turned out that when the big Viking kind of craze, the Vikings TV show came out, that suddenly my little stock design set turned into the canonical stock design set for Viking stuff. Now, I wasn't trying to do that, but if it had happened, maybe I would have turned into the Viking embroidery guy. Who knows? You don't know this stuff. You put stuff out into the world that you're passionate about and you hope for the best, but make sure it's something you enjoy doing if you're going to do it for that reason. What I'll say is, as a digitizer, as an embroiderer, that's one of those things. And I'm really happy to see Ramona's story there. Here are a couple of last things I want to cover, though. Interesting things that I think are coming with stock designs that are different. Up until this point, I talked to you guys about the realities of releasing stock. Releasing stock designs, really, it is done as a blast. People usually want to digitize in one software, and then they want to blast out in all of the different stitch file formats that they can, because they want to make sure that whatever embroiderer picks this stuff up, that they're going to be able to use that stock design format directly on a USB drive right into the embroidery machines. They don't want to have to do any other work to it, right? That's what they're looking for. And so most of the time, you're going to find that stock design folks are outputting stitch files only. They're not going to be doing any sort of working file. I have seen, however, more folks releasing working file stock designs. I think it's really interesting because a working file stock design allows for editing, allows for you to reuse elements very easily, and allows for massive resizing. It's something that I've worked on too. So it's one of those things that I think is interesting to look for. Is it really happening a lot yet? No. Would I like to see it happening more? Absolutely. I would love to see more native file stock designs out there. The people who are using them, that are making collections for software, that's great, because that means we end up with these much more versatile designs that then can be used for more things. Also, some things I've seen that are very interesting for that is using, like for us, we have envelopes and baselines and other sort of text drops where we can make templates where it's very easy to drop personalization in that is custom shaped or otherwise altered specifically to the kind of stock frame or the stock design that we have. And I think that's really cool. I've seen it in Vector for many, many years. Forever, you've been able to get a package of CorelDRAW files where you can retype the name and it's styled specifically for that template so that you can essentially make your team shirts or whatever, and you have a lovely piece of art that you wouldn't have afforded custom, but you can drop a name in and it restyles it to match the art. Well, we can do that kind of thing with templates ourselves. And so that's another interesting thing that I'd like to see more of. And maybe I'm making a wish list here. I have seen some of it coming, but I'd like to see more of it happen. So the more people who can get proficient in their software and start to understand how that native stuff works, I would love to see more people thinking ahead of time about what does resizing look like? Can I specify a range like what we do with our fonts where we specify a minimum maximum range to help people know what to do and allow for some flipping of stitch file types or stitch fill types so that we can work in different sizes? I'd like to see more of that happening because as we do that, we can allow for this kind of range of customization to happen where, as we all know, people are more and more buying online, wanting custom stuff, wanting one-off pieces. I'd like to see the small embroidery producers who do not go all the way out to the embroidery side of things end up with the ability to do customization that looks more custom. Yes, it's still template work. No, it's not somebody getting a graphic designer out there, but it is something where they can literally type in some personalization, do a little bit more resizing and shaping, and get something out of it that is processed and at the right quality. So it's something interesting to look for. Like I said, are you going to see that largely in stock designs? Absolutely not. You're going to see multiple sizes of stuff done in stitch files. And if you can get software, like I said, we have in Brilliance, we have stitch file processing that actually takes account of the position of individual stitches, and it changes the pattern based on that. It makes a fill, and it continues to fill in density, so you get density processing. Or you have other softwares that will try to find the edges of an object and make objects and then reprocess them again. Sometimes you'll have some breaks or some weird texture there, but they will then at least give you fairly moderately normal densities when you scale up. That kind of stuff is possible, but as we all know, it's kind of second best to native. So the more native stuff I see, the more I like it. I like to see more native, definitely more native stock and native template stuff like that coming on. Very cool idea, and it's something that I don't see all the time. So sometimes I share this stuff and somebody will take it over and start making their own little business out of it. Who knows? But with that, guys, last things I'm going to say, as for stock editing, as I said earlier, I talked about appliques. I talked about changing fills to different things. I talked about working on stock. Here's what I'm going to tell you. No matter what you do, I think knowing enough about editing is useful. You never want to have a bad design, especially you get something custom made. You don't want to have a bad outcome because you couldn't move 10 stitches around. You couldn't do a little compensation. You couldn't cut off a piece of text and replace it with some stock text. That stuff is super simple and you should know enough editing to do that. But I would say another part of that is to know when not to edit. So here's the deal. Have editing software, have stitch editing software, have powerful stitch editing software that does processing, that helps you select individual pieces, that lets you take pieces of designs and remove them or change them or add into them. And I would say even have simple digitizing software. Even if you're not going to digitize, how great is it to take like an empty, what I often do is things like, let's say you have a Maltese cross for the fire department. It's something that's in one of these articles. I'm not going to bring it up because we're almost done here. But if you just needed to put a fill behind it, I know that with very little training, most of you, even if you've never drawn a vector in your life, could draw a Maltese cross that has enough overlap to be underneath a satin stitch Maltese cross that's going to run on top of it. Because the thing is, with one layer of satin on top of one layer of fill, you're not going to have too much density. And you could absolutely drop in a fill behind it and have a nice fill behind that satin stitch design without problem. So I would suggest everybody gets good solid editing software, good solid digitizing software, and you know enough to draw simple shapes, to edit a little bit of underlay in when you need it, what the underlay does, why you'd want it, to do a little bit of compensation when you have a tiny gap so you don't have to constantly wait on editing, or if your stock design has a little problem but it's overall pretty good, that you can do a little tiny bit of work. But I also want you to think really hard on the overall quality, and remember that unless it is your passion to move little stitches around, sometimes it just makes sense to either have a new design done, redo a design, or look for a better stock design producer. It's the same thing if you go back and listen to my other take-ups on fonts and on text. If you have 4 characters to create, don't search for the font endlessly unless you're desperate and you need to change which characters those are and you need to match the logo type or something that's already there, then you need the font. Otherwise, if there are 4 characters on screen and your art is not absolute garbage, draw the 4 characters and digitize them yourself as a digitizer. It makes more sense. You're going to spend less time. And unless you are going to end up using different letters later and you need that whole set of letters for some other reason, or you're going to add something that has to match, unless you're going to do that, most of the time, small words, a small set of characters that you have to digitize yourself and break them up into different little satin stitches, it's just going to take less time than doing all the searching and working and recreating. So same thing with stitch designs, with stitch files. Sometimes you get a file, and unless that stock design is a beautiful piece of art you can't live without, and especially if you're looking at it and it just doesn't work well for what you want to do, you can totally resize stock and it works great. But if you're taking pieces and parts and moving it and doing stuff all around, unless you love the process, and don't get me wrong, I'm somebody who likes to tweak stuff, so I sometimes love the process of just doing it. I love reconstructing stuff and playing with it. But unless you love it, sometimes it makes sense to go look for another stock design. So what I'll say is this. Get your software, know that you can edit, know your limitations in your design. So once again, don't just trust that 15, 25%, because sometimes it's less and sometimes it's more. Know what the longest stitch is that you can run and be comfortable, what it's going to do when it gets too long, how it should be underlaid. Know what the smallest stitch is going to do. Know how far apart stitches can be in different thread weights and how close together they will be before they turn into a fill. Know what's too dense. Know when tiny, tiny stitches are going to cause thread breaks and problems. And understand that that longest and shortest stitch and the small gaps are what's going to set what you can do for resizing. Know that stuff and intelligently work on resizing. So have the software and do it. Also, have that digitizing software. Learn how to draw simple shapes, because it is awesome to be able to add a fill, replace a fill, fix something quickly when you can, or make a stock design awesome by adding just a little touch of something you need or fixing something small. But know when your time is better spent somewhere else, especially you folks in the commercial world. Sometimes it just makes sense to send it out. Sometimes it just makes sense to look for a different stock design instead of keeping on working on the same stuff. And hence why I sometimes caution you against buying those big collections of thousands of stock designs. It's not that stock isn't great, and I love some of the stock producers out there, but remember that there is a collection desire that some of us have because we love the embroidery, we love the stock, and it might not be the same as our commercial interest. All right, guys. So with that, that is enough bonus time out of me. I'm going to go. We have more stuff to do, and I've got more to do on the new Embrilliance website. If you guys haven't seen that, go to embrilliance.com. It's It's a baby that Brian and I have been working on for quite some time, and it still has work to do, but looking a lot better these days. And go check out, like I said, 1.165 is out if you're an Brilliance person. I know a lot of you guys have been coming around here lately. Check that out. But with that, guys, hopefully I've given you something to think about with stock designs. I'm going to try and get some rest tonight, and I hope you get some rest too. But take some time to take apart a stock design, maybe the next weekend. How about that? Before the next Takeup, if you are a regular listener, I would like to hear about your adventures in measuring and understanding the settings and stuff in the stock designs. So with that, guys, we have one last question. Jewel says, where do I find previous videos? Wherever you are right now, if you are on Facebook, so it looks like you're on Facebook, if you click on my name, you're going to find that there are previous videos there. And if you're on my YouTube channel, go ahead and once again, click on that icon for the YouTube channel, and you will find that there's a bunch of them there. Otherwise, my name is weird, that little ERICH Campbell. If you look Eric Campbell Takeup, you will find them online because it makes it easier to find. But for the rest of you guys, go out, play, have fun, stitch something, analyze it, tear it up, and show me your cool reasons that you use stock. And I will talk to you again next Friday.